afternoon, and welcome to the ENLIGHT online lectures. I am Esther von Richthofen from the University of Göttingen. COVID-19 changed our lives in many unwelcome and even disastrous ways, but it has also had a few positive side effects. One of them is the increased interest in science. For universities, this is good news. Also, video conferencing is now much more widespread than before. This has created new opportunities for universities to cooperate across borders and makes it much easier to bring together researchers from different countries for public science lectures, such as this one. The European University Network ENLIGHT spans across Europe. It trains over 300,000 learners per year, and the partners share a deep commitment to their social responsibility. The 9 European universities that founded the network introduced the ENLIGHT online format as a new lecture series. Each ENLIGHT online lecture invites experts from these universities to share their knowledge, thereby bringing a European perspective to the public scientific debate. Our very first ENLIGHT lecture is entitled Literature, Narratives, and COVID-19. If you enjoy this event and have some more time to spare, please tune in again this evening for our second public lecture, New Virus, New Detection Protocols, 6 p.m. Central European Time. I will now hand over to Professor Daniel Carey, who will present his research and moderate the session. Daniel is Director of the Moore Institute for Research in the Humanities and Social Studies at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and he is Professor of English. He is Vice President of the Royal Irish Academy and serves on the Irish Research Council. His research focuses on early modern travel, intellectual history, and history of science. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you very much, Esther. Delighted to be here, and thank you to you and to your colleagues in Göttingen for leading the way with this series. We're very grateful to Thomas Richter in Göttingen for looking after the technical side of today's discussion. The ENLIGHT network that you were describing is already showing benefits, I think, in terms of bringing together colleagues for discussion and exchange, as we're going to do today. So I'd like now to introduce today's speakers for our session on literature, narrative, and COVID-19. I'll do so alphabetically. Marysa Demoor is a senior full professor at Ghent University in Belgium. She's the author of Their Fair Share, Women, Power, and Criticism in the Athenaeum, 1870 to 1920. She has edited a number of books, including The Lure of Illustration in the 19th Century and the Dictionary of 19th Century Journalism, as well as the Cambridge Handbook to Literary Authorship, which appeared last year. Her recent research explores the cross-cultural history of Britain and Belgium in the long 19th century. Stephen Donovan teaches at the Department of English, Uppsala University in Sweden. He has published on Joseph Conrad, empire writing, and periodicals history, and he's currently working with Matthew Rubery on a study of Victorian investigative journalism and the novel. Raili Marling is Professor of English Studies at the University of Tartu in Estonia. Her research interests include gender in modernist and contemporary literature, neoliberal biopolitics, critical affect studies, and the possibilities of combining affect and discourse studies. As Esther was saying, my name is Daniel Carey. I'm based at the National University of Ireland, Galway. And I've been very much looking forward to today's discussion, where we're going to range widely in terms of subject matter and also century. Please do ask us questions using the chat function. We are now going to start with Stephen Donovan, who's going to talk about Daniel Defoe. So, Stephen, over to you.
Good afternoon. Just over 300 years ago, on the 26th of November, 1703, Britain was battered by the greatest hurricane in its history. The hurricane left a trail of death and destruction, but it also had a literary impact. Almost at once, Daniel Defoe began writing an account of the event. It appeared in July 1704 with the dramatic title, The Storm, or a collection of the most remarkable casualties and disasters which happened in the late dreadful tempest, both by sea and land. And it's freely available from the Internet Archive and Project Gutenberg, by the way. The book is a mishmash of edited letters, first-hand description, and commentary. There's even some bad poetry. But Defoe's Storm is more than the sum of its parts. it signaled the beginning of a genre of writing that we might call journalistic reportage, in this case, coverage of a catastrophe. And it took an original approach to the hurricane, as a force of nature, as a phenomenon of human consciousness, and above all, as a shared national experience of trauma and loss. In my research, I mostly work on literature and journalism after 1850. Right now, I'm co-writing a study of investigative journalism and the Victorian novel. But Defoe's storm has always interested me. It is a forerunner of investigative journalism, which only really emerged in the 19th century. More than this, Defoe's storm was itself a new literary form. It is almost as though an unprecedented act of nature demanded a new kind of storytelling. The hurricane of 1703 was not just a social and economic disaster. It posed a narrative challenge. Is it really possible to describe a collective event? What should such an account include? Should it describe events as they happened, what we might call realistically, or should it order those events within some religious or political framework? Defoe wrote the storm 15 years before Robinson Crusoe, that landmark in the history of another literary form, the novel. And 18 years later, he would write a journal of the plague year, which Daniel will be discussing next. And in the century that followed, weather would become a permanent feature of the nation's conversation with itself, and indeed of British identity. So this lends the storm an obvious interest for literary historians and Defoe scholars in particular. But the COVID pandemic of 2020 has given Defoe's storm a larger significance. Like Defoe, we are all asking ourselves, where did this disaster come from? Why has it happened now? How are other people experiencing it? And above all, the question that Defoe himself struggled hardest with, what, if anything, does a national disaster mean? The hurricane of 1703 raked Britain from coast to coast. It did most damage in Wales and central and southern England. On land, it caused over 100 deaths, flattening trees, crops, homes, and windmills. As much as 10% of the value of England's housing stock was lost in a single night, 10,000 properties in Kent alone. At sea, things were, if anything, even worse. The hurricane smashed lighthouses and coastal defenses and wrecked 100 ships. More than 8,000 people were drowned. What were Defoe's thoughts as he picked his way through the wreckage in London the following day? Well, his first thought must have been, why did I have to lose my brick and tile factory this year of all years? But he was a penniless journalist with bills to pay. So his second thought must have been, I need to whip out an original account of this historic event. The problem was how to gather the necessary information quickly and widely. Defoe's solution was ingenious and used two of the fastest communication networks of his day, the postal service and the newspaper. He placed an advertisement in the Daily Courant, asking readers to write to him about their own experiences and to send, quote, true particulars of the hurricane's impact in their local area. Within days, replies began to pour in. This was a very modern idea, to harness the dynamic of correspondence sent to a newspaper editor. At this time, let's remember, newspapers were often not much more than collections of letters. Defoe didn't need to go out and find the story. His correspondence would do it for him. Content generated by readers for free. Defoe's storm also marked a break from how extreme weather events were usually written about. These tended to be in one of two modes. The first is personal testimony, either real or imagined. In the memoirs of shipwreck survivors or in ballads about floods, the focus is on the suffering of the narrator or the main protagonists. The other mode is external analysis, a moralizing sermon about divine punishment, a newspaper notice of crop damage or an overdue ship. The significance of the event is located in its context for believers or for merchants. Take, for example, the play of The Weather, which is a Tudor drama from 1533 by John Heywood. The heart of the play is a series of speeches by individuals explaining why they need or prefer a particular kind of weather. The watermiller needs rain. The merchant needs fair weather. A young boy longs for snow. And in the other corner, we have a text like The Great Frost, which was a pamphlet by John Decker, published in 1608. In it, a Londoner describes to a Yorkshireman how the Thames has frozen over and all the wonderful activities that have taken place as a result. Works like these almost always imagine weather in terms of strangeness or alterity. Not everyone is a miller. Not everyone lives by the Thames. In effect, these writers have set themselves the task of communicating an experience that for most of their audience is novel or even extraordinary. In other words, despite their differences, both these kinds of works are spectating on someone else's experience. Things were very different for Defoe and his contemporaries. To be alive in Britain on the 27th of November, 1703, was to be part of a shared natural catastrophe. Unlike wars, unlike plagues, unlike droughts, the Great Hurricane had been experienced simultaneously, or as simultaneously as can be, in a world without telegraphy, radio, television, or even standardized timekeeping. Defoe's storm fuses these modes of weather writing into a comprehensive, panoramic, fully human document. He collates a wide range of external sources, classical authorities, scientific opinion, and even religious explanations. I like the way that although Defoe calls the hurricane divine judgment on several occasions, he clearly can't decide if some or all of humanity is to blame. He reprints statistical tables showing barometric pressure and details of shipping losses. Above all, he describes the action of the hurricane in minute detail, the spire of Ipswich Cathedral that falls 3 yards into the earth through 2 coffins, the waterspout that looks like an elephant's trunk. These are interspersed with dozens of letters, the inside stories, as it were. Each account echoes the others while adding something new. One famous letter even takes us inside the hurricane as it happens. Supposedly from a naval officer at sea, it is written in the present tense. Quote, "We are all left here in a dismal condition, expecting every moment to be all drowned, for here is a great storm and is very likely to continue." It's the 18th century equivalent of, "And now we go live to our correspondent." As a piece of writing, Defoe's storm is messy and incoherent. Precise measurements of hail are followed by bizarre incidents and uncanny coincidences. The fish that are blown out of their pond in St. James's Park. The engineer who dies inside his own lighthouse at the same time as a model of it is being smashed to pieces 200 miles away. But for me, this messiness is what makes the book so fascinating. By recording external events alongside internal experiences in this way, Defoe's storm suggests that the hurricane was not just something that had happened to the British people. It had not just flooded their homes, ruined their businesses, and injured their neighbours. Some part of it had also entered their sense of self, their connectedness to each other, both as British citizens and more deeply as human beings. For this is what real crises do. Like the hurricane of 1703, the COVID pandemic of 2020 will undoubtedly leave its mark on literature, journalism, and other media forms. We have seen the national and local press try in various ways to represent its scale and implications. The interactive scientific guides, the newspaper memory walls, and the video footage of emergency wards. Digital media have come to regulate our working and social lives, including this shared broadcasting format that we're using at this very minute. And we can expect a slew of novels and dramas about COVID in the months and years to come. In the meantime, as we sit in the eye of our own hurricane, this is a very good moment to reread Daniel Defoe's The Storm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Yeah, now it's over to me to make my contribution. I'm going to try to pick up on some of the themes that Stephen was talking about and to continue to reflect on Defoe, who is this protean figure. I mean, really an extraordinary repertoire of fictions that he created, but it's also the interplay with journalism that Stephen brought out that I think is so productive in Defoe's case. Obviously, journalism has to be thought of historically. And I'm sure that's something that Marysa can also help us thinking about too in the 19th century as we progress our narrative through the centuries. So what I'm going to talk about in my time is the Journal of the Plague Year. It's obviously highly relevant. It focuses on the Great Plague of London in 1665 to 66. And Defoe published it in 1720. He was always had an eye for timely events. There had been a major plague outbreak in Marseille, and so the concern was that it would make its way towards London at this time. So he found his way to various documentary sources. And one of my convictions in looking at the book during this time is that it's probably the best guide to public health officials that you could possibly come up with. The most efficient use of their time, if they wanted to figure out how people are going to react to COVID-19, would have been to read Journal of the Plague Year. So what do we see in the book that helps us in thinking about the current moment? Obviously, the spread of rumor and report, which reminds us of how social media has functioned in our own time. COVID-19 is the first pandemic in the social media era, and I think we have to come to terms with the way that stories circulate, but also rumors in particular, and the challenges of sorting out fact and fiction. I guess one of the points of Defoe's work in Journal of the Plague Year is that it turns out that stories are as communicable as disease itself, but they're also in their own way quite unreliable. We see at the same time throughout the book, but certainly early on, the pattern of people fleeing London when they feel that the plague is making its way towards them. There were some interesting pieces globally, but some of the ones that I saw were in the New York Times, mapping the desertion of Manhattan by postcode, in effect, or zip code. And it was quite striking that those in the upper socioeconomic bracket were deserting the city with greater alacrity, unsurprisingly. What Defoe is doing in this book, he has this narrator who's unnamed. He's just called HF. We have his initials only. And he meditates particularly on documentary sources and a variety of sources of information. He's particularly interested in what are called the bills of mortality. The bills of mortality are weekly records of deaths by parish. He is based in the city of London, so he's tracking a very specific geographical location. So some of the causes of death are rather interesting. They include teeth, surfeiting, spotted fever, which is a little bit more recognizable, and of course the plague. But one of the things we discover in looking at this source as HF guides us through it is that statistics are unreliable, that deaths are underreported. In other words, you have to engage in a form of skeptical and probabilistic reasoning in encountering any form of public information. He says at one point, the weekly bills, I have reason to be assured, never gave a full account by many thousands. And as he reaches the end of the book, the official death toll is said to be 68,590, but he believes that it's closer to 100,000. And Defoe, or HF, his narrator, if you prefer, seems to be closer to the mark. But we can also see through the bills of mortality the geographical progression throughout the parishes in the city of London itself. We see at the same time the heroism of public health officials, those who put themselves at extraordinary risk, and they remind us obviously of the courage of frontline workers. We have, for example, the watchmen of houses. They're there to make sure that people are locked inside. They don't always do this job very effectively, but they're nonetheless putting themselves at extraordinary risk. We see plenty of stories in the book about elaborate methods of escaping lockdown, including the breaking down of walls, climbing over them, across rooftops. There's even an explosion at one point in order to drive off a watchman. The watchman can be sent on errands in order to make these opportunities more available. It's also a time, as the narrative makes clear, of magical thinking and magical cures, a whole series of fanciful explanations, prophecies of one kind and another, looking for signs. It's the kind of thing that Stephen was talking about. Quack cures abound, and some of the handbills are described. So we have various different pills, potions, and preservatives. One can't help but be reminded of Donald Trump in particular, with his touting of bleach, which was the most extreme case. And of course, people followed his advice, in some case fatally, but also his attachment to hydroxychloroquine, which, as we know, they've stopped clinical trials on as having no value. The narrator seeks out information of his own witness, but also of a variety of different sources. And he wants to witness for himself what the plague pits look like. So in one memorable sequence in the book, he goes out to Aldgate to see a plague pit and to examine it, and putting himself, of course, at extraordinary risk in the midst of doing so. And we have seen, of course, across the world, the phenomenon of mass graves and a reintroduction of this during moments in which officials have been overwhelmed. Perhaps the most extraordinary case, again in New York, of refrigerator trucks backing up at the back of hospitals. He's based in the city of London, as I mentioned, and the city becomes, in a fascinating way during this book, a self-governing entity, in effect. The court removes to Oxford, and so it is really for public officials of one kind and another to look after the affairs of the city. And I think there is perhaps a kind of Republican message in the book, almost in that respect. And I find certain parallels in a way in what is going on in the UK during a moment of extraordinary crisis, where the management at the government level has been inept and problematic, but some of the most effective interventions have been taken at a more local level. We have in this book a very sophisticated meditation on the relationship between truth, fiction, and the documentary record, and, as I say, probable reasoning. So statistics are a key point. The bills of mortality are not an accurate record. They are an indication. They are a representation that stands for reality. And in just the same way, Defoe gives us in the book a series of representative stories. The narrator, HF, is usually fairly scrupulous about telling us where he got them from. Many of them are not his own personal witness. They are things that are told to him. So if they are not necessarily individually true, they speak to a larger truth in the way that statistics are meant to do. He says, for example, at one point, I could give a great many stories such as these, diverting enough, which in the long course of that dismal year I met with, that is, heard of, and which are very certain to be true, or very near the truth. That is to say, true in the general, for no man could at such a time learn all the particulars. Again, reminds us of some of the things that Stephen was saying about the nature of reportage. So there's quite a deep, I think, and fascinating relationship to statistics in the novel. Statistics capture a general truth. They offer not complete accuracy, but a survey, which is understood by the narrator as amounting to a sample. The sample is significant. It has some validity because it is grounded in a general truth. Now, the other thing that Defoe does, and I think this is also noticed by Stephen, is he's very attracted to what I call inset stories, little narrative digressions. And what is their meaning? Well, in a number of instances, I think that they function as case studies. So they are, in that sense, expressive of a larger truth, but they still retain their own particularity. And I think we're still working with forms of communication and dissemination of meaning in that way. The other resource for Defoe in this book is what I would call parabolic form. There's a story of two brothers and their kinsmen from Wapping who set out to escape the city. And this becomes an extended digression, if you like, within the text itself. But it starts to be this, again, this self-governing community which emerges on its own terms, which tries to solve its own problems in the midst of a crisis situation. Now, towards the end of the book, the narrator comments on his own failed attempts to assemble a list of men in office who had died during the outbreak. So there's this very strong documentary impulse throughout. He says, men did no more die by tale and by number. They might put out a weekly bill and call them 7 or 8,000 or what they pleased. 'Tis certain that they died by heaps and were buried by heaps. That is to say, without a count. So one of the things I think which is really quite extraordinary about this work, Journal of the Plague Year, is how it brings counting and accounting into relationship. They are central to this fiction, and they bring reckoning and writing into a very close relationship. So I will stop there. And now we'll turn over to Marysa Demoor, and Marysa is going to talk about the 19th century.
So thank you, Dan, for the introduction, and thank you, Stephen, for providing a peg for my talk by mentioning and looking at investigative journalism. Indeed, I'm here intrigued by something related to it, something which I've called prevention narratives in print media or in journalism, if you prefer. I came to this subject very recently, and I must admit I've only skimmed a few surfaces as yet. Now, the starting point of my interests were the many mixed messages or sometimes downright unreliable information that came to us from or through official media. The world leaders, and Dan's alluded to it already, saying the most absurd things about COVID-19 and how to deal with it. And experts from one country saying one thing and from another country another thing. So as a specialist in periodicals, I wanted to know more about the guidelines on prevention as propounded by a top journal such as The Lancet. So that was one starting point. And another thought was that this is not the first pandemic, as we've heard, to hit the world and that the world has had to deal with. It might be interesting to know which measures were taken on the previous occasions, since after all, humankind survived. Perhaps that's not such a good thing. I mean, I would leave that in the middle. One of those pandemics is the Spanish flu associated with the First World War. In the course of May 2020, let me see whether this is working now. I should have put this on. Hang on, there we go. This particular picture was circulating on social media and said to have been taken during the Spanish flu, the disease that decimated the European and North American population in the last year of the First World War and the 2 years afterwards. It's a picture of elegant young women wearing fashionable hats that have what seems to be face masks attached to them. It later transpired that the picture was taken before the war in 1913, actually, and had no connection with the flu whatsoever. But the photos led me to wonder about the situation then, I mean, after the war, and what the precautions were people had been advised to take. At the same time, it points to the fake information, the fake news about contagious disease like COVID-19, called a deceptively nasty disease by Boris Johnson yesterday. So I was wondering what he meant by deceptively there, and the success or failure of prevention campaigns. There is an article in the New York Times that does indicate that nurses during the First World War, and this is a picture of a nurse in Philadelphia actually, and during that flu outbreak, as it were, did wear face masks. So wearing face masks is certainly not a new thing. It seems nurses in 1918 already knew what the Lancet recommended on the 1st of June 2020, that is that nursing personnel should keep its distance and wear masks. So this is what you find in the Lancet just a couple of months ago. The findings of this systematic review and meta-analysis support physical distancing of 1 meter or more and provide quantitative estimates for models and contact tracing to inform policy. Optimum use of face masks, respirators, and eye protection in public and healthcare settings should be informed by these findings and contextual factors. Robust randomized trials are needed to better inform the evidence for these interventions, but this systematic appraisal of currently best available evidence might inform interim guidance. So it's still not, this is not followed everywhere, I should add perhaps. So for the history of face masks, I can refer to another article in The Lancet that was printed a while ago. You have the entire history of face masks going back centuries. So if you're interested, check it out, it's online. But not everyone was wearing face masks during the Spanish flu epidemic, and the advice people were given did not always involve the wearing of face masks. I have another quotation for you here. How to avoid influenza. 1, do not breathe through the mouth, but through the nose. 2, use soap and water for washing the inside of the nose night and morning. Gargle with clean water. 3, after forcing yourself to sneeze night and morning, take deep inspirations. 4, do not wear a muffler round the neck. 5, take sharp walks regularly and always walk home from work. Avoid crowds. 7, sleep with open windows and keep the bed warm. Do not dope. 8, avoid intoxicating liquors and eat plenty of nourishing food. Porridge is desirable. So this was some of the advice readers of The People were given in November 1918, a few days before the end of the First World War, when that so-called Spanish flu had been raging for a few months already. The instructions present a mixture of sound advice and fabrications and predate much of the often nonsensical advice given during the COVID-19 pandemic by some world leaders. The parallels between the Spanish flu and the corona epidemic are legion and indicate that nothing or little has been learned from the earlier 20th century disaster. So is this really the case? A preliminary analysis of contemporary newspaper articles suggests a number of broad parallels between the ways COVID-19 or corona and H1N1 or the Spanish flu were discussed. 1, there is a curious vagueness about the exact number of deaths. 2, there is a similar speculation about the origin of the disease. And 3, the same countries are pointed at as responsible for its deathly eruption. But possibly by analyzing the role of the press, the spread and containment of the virus, including the gradual transition to normalcy, can we learn from a previous occurrence of a similar tragedy? Although there were no social media then, people were also badgered at the time with scores of adverts for this or that miracle cure. I'm just going to show you one here from the Cambridge Independent Press, published on the 23rd of February 1900. So you can see that there are choices. You can either go for Liebig's extract of meat or Dr. Armstrong's influenza mixture, and you can buy those at Boots, cash chemists. Others were poking fun at the phenomenon, but I'm sure you will recognize some of the stories we too were fed more than a century later. There is this tale where the protagonist is a certain Maria, and she tries to take care of her son during an influenza pandemic. And so she tries to inform herself. This is a tale published in Moonshine in 1892. So he has succumbed to influenza and she wants to nurse him back to health. Her idea is that the great thing is prevention. So she's right there. And what has she found about this influenza epidemic? I'll try to read it for you because it might be difficult to read it on screen. She first of all discovered that it was a Chinese malaria produced by decomposition through the overflowing of the Wango. Next, she leaned to the opinion that it was the dengue fever. And then she came to the conclusion that it was all due to an escape of Koch's bacilli into space during an early stage of that scientist's experiments. So you see, it's quite a recognizable story there. The best list of precautions, well, in an ironical way, is a piece of doggerel found in Punch, published in 1849, where the author writes, not to be taken seriously, of course, that hygiene is very important. My wife and children too, I make to arm the constitution each morn their soap and water take and do the like ablution. Scrubbed sweet and clean, I've had my home from garrets to foundation and taken care in every room to establish ventilation. Beneath my kitchen ran a drain which off the nose offended. The sink was faulty, it was plain, I caused it to be mended. Then also on a certain head I've made a large reduction. 1 mild glass only, just ere bed is my extent of suction. The money saved in drink I spent in good nutritious diet and warm apparel. Now my friend, you know my system, try it. Then epidemics you may view with very slight misgiving. They seldom trouble people who adopt my style of living. So the conclusion might be that the diversity advice given in the media drives its readers crazy. What to believe? Even in The Guardian of the 31st of January 2020, we found an article under the title, Why Wear Masks? And then when you read it, it says, it ends on a philosophical note saying, masks have also become what he calls a risk ritual, providing a sense of control over an uncontrollable situation. Just as we can't avoid being exposed to pollution in cities, flu is a force of nature. You get it when you get it, but by doing something, at least you feel you're taking control. Is taking control what it's all about? There is still a lot of confusion, and in a situation of life and death, that's not good. A Victorian GP in 1893 was at his wit's end when noticing that children visited the homes of other children infected by scarlet fever, and children were dying like flies. These were young children between the ages of 5 and 13. So this GP decided to do something about it, and he wrote to the local educational board listing a number of measures that should be taken in order to regain control over the situation. And I've just summarized his letter, which was published in The Lancet. So the letter is about the school policy regarding an epidemic of scarlet fever. It was mainly targeting working class children between the ages of 5 to 13. What was happening, children stayed at home because they were ill, and then they were visited by the other children who brought them their homework and notes, class notes, so that they could continue learning. And then that child, the visiting child, fell ill and had scarlet fever, and those children usually died after a certain while. So this GP is complaining about the happy-go-lucky style in which infectious disease is managed, and he writes a report on precautionary measures as to how to deal with this disease, with this epidemic. But the board decided that it was far too expensive. And he concludes by saying, well, if it's necessary to decide between health and education, there should be no hesitation. We should opt for health, right? But is there a choice to be made between health or education, one might wonder. In the Lancet of the 25th of May, 2020, there comes some kind of a compromise conclusion if you read what the UNESCO Chair of Health, Education and Sustainable Development says there. So this person strongly believes that education is health. So you have a compromise of the two. Well-being promotion in the school setting, resulting from a process of meaningful and transformative learning, can represent the lever for a knowledge-based health culture, impacting not only the behaviors of students, but also those of their families and communities. So I just wonder what the Victorian GP would have said about that, thought about that. It's 150 years on since the earliest article mentioned in this talk, and here we are still struggling with the same problems of prevention. So let's get at least a recommendation in the media right. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marysa. We'll come back to some of these questions. So I wanted to hand over to Raili now for her contribution. Raili.
Hi, thank you for having me in this panel. And I kind of have to start from the Monty Python now to something completely different, because I work with the very unenviable material that is literature of the 21st century. And so I go into the very, very murky waters of prediction and trying to figure out where the fiction might take us when it tries to represent what seems to be quite unrepresentable. So I'm building on what my colleagues just said about earlier representations and journalistic representations, and try to make some, well, probably very sketchy predictions on the basis of that. Especially because I think that one of the issues that we come to when we think about COVID-19 is that it escapes easy representation. When you have a hurricane, it kind of is unescapable. When you have a plague and people are dying around you, it's kind of unescapable. But many of us actually, despite being quarantined and mildly inconvenienced, nevertheless have been able to continue living. And I think that that has been part of the ironies of our present crisis. It's everywhere, it is serious, it's changing lives, economies, but it's slightly invisible. And this is the thing that my work is sort of based on, because I think that not all pandemics have yielded themselves to similar kind of representation. Here too, we see references to Defoe. I mean, it has been impossible not to see Defoe in newspapers in the past 3 months, because when you think about that, we actually don't have a great novel about the 1918 influenza, for example, at least not in English, not that I can think about. And I think that there might be a similar problem coming up with COVID-19. As Marysa also showed, you know, newspapers have mostly been covering medical advice. And in the early phases of COVID-19, the best that newspapers could come up with was basically empty streets. COVID-19 is marked by absence in many ways. And unless you were yourself a frontline worker or an immediate family member of somebody who suffered COVID-19, you could basically not know what was going on. So this kind of ties to my overall interest in what I choose to call crisis ordinariness, and I was working on this before COVID-19, but the present crisis has only made that more relevant. Because even before the crisis hit us, life for many of us was characterized by economic uncertainty and different levels of personal instability. Especially because this unease was exacerbated by a sense of violence. A violence that was created by climate change, by complex socioeconomic processes, but they were all invisible, although they were inexorable. And this slow violence, so to say, is, I think, that is also visible to us sort of indirectly in COVID-19. We have had different kinds of upheavals in the past decade or so, populist upheavals, which have intensified of late, and they, in my sort of understanding, emanate from a sense of betrayal in people who realize that this slow violence that they cannot quite see has been eroding the taken for granted promises of good life that they seem to be entitled to. This erosion, which they cannot ignore or avoid, creates not only anger, but also different kinds of lower key affective responses, anxiety, unease, to name but a few. And I think that COVID-19 has produced something similar, something that could be called scaled down affects that seem to be our best response to the numbingly ordinary pace of the crisis that meets us every day. And I evoke here the work of the American literary scholar Laurent Berlant, who argues that crisis is no longer exceptional trauma, but something that is systematic. An invisible presence that, in her words, quote, unfolds in stories about navigating what's overwhelming, unquote. Crisis, in other words, is ordinary, and people have to develop skills for adjusting to newly proliferating pressures to scramble for modes of living on. We know that the world that we know is ending, but we maintain the routines to stay sane, So we kind of have developed not just the risk rituals that Marysa was talking about, like face masks, but we also have other rituals, routine rituals. There's no better time to practice gardening or yoga, as newspapers tell us. And this is one in this book. Mark O'Connell, the book titled Notes from an Apocalypse, is mulling on the question whether we can just ignore the end of the world. And he says, in the book, obviously written as well as published before COVID-19, let's at least be honest about this. The apocalypse is profoundly dull. I, for one, am sick to death of the end of days. Is it possible to be terrified and bored at the same time? Is it possible, I mean, to be bored of terror? If not of the kind of literal terror that privileged people like me rarely experience. And I think this has been a psychological question that many of us have grappled with, that COVID-19 has not been eventful. Nothing has happened to most of us. It is profoundly boring. It is ordinary. And I think that this very ordinariness is what intrigues, well, not just me, but should intrigue many of us as scholars, because the apocalypse lacks eventfulness. It can be ignored. We all congratulate ourselves for growing onions on the windowsills and for rediscovering boredom, as we have seen in literary journals for the past 3 months. This odd crisis management strategy, in my belief, is sharpened by the fact that we live in societies where we are supposed to be entrepreneurs of ourselves. And we have been trained to be resilient and adaptable in the face of constant change. And we are supposed to take all of this change as a stimulating challenge. In other words, we already, before the crisis hit, were acting like survivalists who were like scavengers, trying to maintain this paradox of entrepreneurial optimism, and at the same time that we knew we were being defeated by life. This is then this odd time that we already inhabited before COVID-19 hit. We already were pulled in 2 directions. We knew that we were supposed to be very, very scared. At the same time, we also knew that we were supposed to be optimistic, open to change, and to project happiness. This kind of contradiction, obviously, is hard to maintain. And I think it only has been deepened during COVID-19. It also is certainly very hard to capture in any form of representation. Reportage, and I think my own research into contemporary journalism also shows on the affective states that people live in have really privileged the work of either the super privileged or then the frontline workers and left most of us invisible. And I think that literary text might be the space in which this contradictory affective world might eventually emerge because of the very marginality of fiction, I believe. It might be the space where we see first responses to the so-called suspended agency of today, because they leave lots of space for the unarticulated and also the inarticulable, the kind of a vague space that media cannot quite afford to leave us with. And maybe that's where we are going to find more ambient and diffused feelings. Obviously, we don't yet have the great COVID-19 novel. And yet I think that there are a couple of books that already were trying to get towards capturing the stasis and anxiety of crisis ordinariness, even before the present problem started. And I'm just going to use one example. This is a book by the Chinese-American novelist Ling Ma from 2018, titled Severance. And it, I think, is interesting not only because it talks about the response of the United States and the rest of the world to a mysterious virus that originates from China, but rather it talks about the ways in which we adapt to crisis by basically routine and a ritualization of routine. The narrator of this novel, Candace Chen, is a 20-something Chinese-American immigrant who works at a Manhattan publishing house that prints Bibles. I think probably not an accident. The title obviously refers to corporate layoffs, one of the things that we have also seen in response to COVID-19. Candace, however, lives through work, like a good neoliberal subject that she is, and she remains the last employee of a publishing house who continues to work, go to work every day, eventually moving into the office when the city's transit infrastructure breaks down. Today too, I think we all know how it feels to not work. And we cling to work as one of our sanity rituals. We too are forced to work increasingly while we sleep. And we struggle to distinguish between work and the non-work. But it is this familiarity of the routine that keeps us sane and also keeps Candace sane in the novel. Work does not end, in other words, at the end of the world. And the remaining scavengers whom Candace eventually joins spend their days too working on staying alive. So in other words, despite the apocalyptic premise of the novel, as readers, we actually do not meet panic. We don't meet eventfulness, but something closer to boredom, as O'Connell also suggested. As the novel makes clear on the first page, disaster fiction often fails to predict the world. A quote from the novel: "We found one another after fleeing New York for safer pastures of the countryside. We'd seen it done in the movies, though no one could say which one exactly. A lot of things didn't play out as they had been depicted on screen," unquote. We, as literary scholars, I think, all hope that when and if the COVID-19 novels start to emerge, they give us a space or a tool for negotiating these complexities, emotional complexities, affective complexities that the constant hum of everyday, ordinary, never-ending crisis provides. And through this, I think we as literary scholars can contribute to the social conversation on living on, because I think that that's one aspect that maybe other fields haven't been able to dig into as deeply. So I would like to put that as my final thought on the table, like what can we as literary scholars add to the finding of solutions to COVID-19? So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yes, let's, if we can kind of resume our position, so to speak, as a panel, we have time for some questions and reflections on some really interesting contributions. Obviously, we've ranged substantially in terms of time period, but also taking us there with Raili's comments to the present day. I just wanted to pick up on a few themes that I see as emerging. One is clearly the issue of representation. How do we find a method of representing this, which is really about building a relationship to it? And the relationship is one of the imagination, but also epistemic. We're trying to understand something which seems to be beyond our capacities, even as we attempt to do it. I think there's clearly a question about the relationship more generally between truth and fiction, about how information circulates, and as I say, more generally about the imagination and its place here. I wanted to pick up on a point that Raili you were making there, but I'd like to emphasize it's not our special topic today, but I would like to make a larger case for the role of the humanities really in trying to navigate through this crisis. I think that role is only going to become more important, and yet I think we're in danger of being written out of the story almost entirely. I mean, we begin with heroics in science, then we deal with economic implications of the crisis. To a certain extent, the social sciences, and in particular, the challenges of mitigating the crisis, and then the humanities just disappear into the territory of I don't know what. And yet, I think some of these contributions have demonstrated, one, that we've had long histories of dealing with these problems, often unsuccessfully, and that some attention to it, in fact, if we wanted to be incredibly practical, would have helped us in this moment in time. Just picking up on some questions that have come in, one of which is, and I think we might begin with Raili here. Did you assume, I think it's to all of us really, but did you assume that this would happen in our lifetimes? I apologize for burdening you, Raili, with that question, but you seem to be equipped in some ways in terms of work that you've been reading.
Of course, the answer is no. That's the very nature of the crisis that we cannot see or experience, and the very annoyance of waking up every day and saying it's still here is, I think, very familiar to all of us. And I think that's one of the things that we actually learned from looking at the previous fiction. Nobody saw the plague coming in Venice. Nobody saw the hurricane coming. So. However, of course, we can, hindsight vision is always perfect, right? we can see the traces of this, our failures, and journalism has been doing a great job in showing where we messed up by failing to see the cues and failing to read the signs, so to say.
I don't know, Stephen or Marysa, whether you have any thoughts. Did you have any, you hadn't gone down to the local bookie and placed a bet on a pandemic? I take it.
I did read a very depressing popular science book in about 1998 called The Coming Plague, and ever since then I've kind of been waiting for something like this. But to answer more seriously, I think what makes it particularly valuable is not much that predicts the future, only fortune tellers that it alerts to what we take for granted. I think all great literary works do that, war novels in particular, or novels of imprisonment. And there are spectacular science fiction novels which, whilst having not been fulfilled, have also made us think, what would happen if it snowed for 40 days continually in a country like England? This is Richard Jefferies' story. Or what would happen if there was a submarine raid of England in 1913? This is Conan Doyle's Danger. And I think that's what the power of the literary work does, is it makes us think about what is exterior to our present moment.
Yeah, Marysa, you're obviously a student of periodicals, which are a mixed form, naturally, in terms of contributions, and you're quoting poetry as well as stuff which is more informational, I guess, and indeed advertisements as well. I mean, do you think that, did that give you a way of anticipating how we might experience the current moment? Has it played out in ways that you thought would actually be, yeah, this is more or less the trajectory?
Well, I don't think there was anything predictable about COVID-19. In spite of the fact that we've had so many epidemics already, as Raili said, it was something that came to us and we weren't expecting it. But my interest is really in how this is going to be covered in literature. I mean, as you indicated, there's going to be novels written about this. Although I can't find any such novels in the 19th century when you had typhoid epidemics and all sorts of epidemics. There's only this residue, as it were, this kind of playing with the thought in the journals. And I've looked everywhere to find a piece of writing that could achieve that status of literature, but I couldn't find anything. There's just this playful way of, was that a kind of view on life? You don't have to take it seriously. Was it because people were dying much faster than they're doing now, and we're not so used to death around us as they were? I mean, that might have been a reason, but I would have thought, for instance, that the death of Albert, Prince Albert, from typhoid would at least have led to some writings about that and this kind of disease, but couldn't find anything. Perhaps Stephen has and could tell me about it, but there's only this, there's the adverts, there's the kind of doggerel verse, there are journalistic articles, and usually they don't take it seriously. So I assume there's a lot about the Spanish flu, but it's not my century. So,
that's an interesting question for us, obviously, how this story is going to be told. And there will be multiple incarnations of it. I think that there is obviously a role for oral history, but also that we need to create the materials around which this history can be written. They will be both more abundant and also potentially evanescent, because we probably won't have the same degree of access to letters as a form.
Yes.
Perhaps archive their emails, I'm not so sure. I want to come back to this kind of question of how we assimilate a kind of crisis like this. I think your point just there is an interesting one about death rates and what stands out, what is extraordinary. Because I think we're both pulling in the direction of something remarkable, and people go to the word unprecedented, or at least for the last 100 years. And at the same time, I think really the implication of what you were saying was, we're living not so much in the era of disasters, but of anxiety and of kind of crises that now look to be relatively frequent in their occurrence. I think that's going to be a challenge for us to try to assimilate. There's a question too about how people will remember this moment and the investment people may have in forgetting. That's an interesting one. I don't know whether anybody has any views on how quickly this is going to be forgotten, partly because people have an investment in forgetting. It's the more convenient way of relating to the world. Yeah.
The thing is, of those, that the majority of people dying are 70 and or older than 70 even. And so who's going to write the story of these people? I wonder about that. I mean, there's so much fiction about young officers and soldiers dying in the First World War, right? Because they were young, and that appeals to the readership.
Yeah.
So is this going to be the same thing? It's because it's the elderly who die, and, you know, it's a kind of attitude there that, and also people, you know, from other countries, you know, with a kind of migration background, they are victims of this disease too. And so somehow it might lead to marginalization of this particular epidemic because of the kind of victim that it's
I wanted to sort of agree with Marysa on that one, because I think that part of the reason why so many people are lackadaisical in their everyday behaviors is that they think it's not about them. You know, it's just natural selection. Let's get rid of the dead wood, so to say. And that indeed might lead to interesting generational clashes. I think that that is one of the stories that might be emerging out of the narrative of COVID-19. You know, who is going to bear the economic burden and also the narrative burden, I guess.
That's an extremely important point. And my understanding of the 1918-19 flu is that it did not affect the elderly, interestingly enough. It was
no.
They already had immunity.
Yeah, so there are some, you know, curious etiology in that sense. Stephen, I was wondering about, I hope this is not an unfair question, about the kind of climate change and that question about how we connect ourselves to larger events which are very abstract and difficult to relate to. I think some people wanting to advocate for greater urgency in relation to the climate crisis have thought this is great. We can now imagine it more readily because of what's happened. On the other hand, are we less able to because we've exhausted our capacities for identifying with a crisis? I don't know if you have a take on that.
I think this is a very interesting question, isn't it? How particular social and natural forces shape our representations of ourselves. Some diseases do have a strong literary presence. I mean, tuberculosis is almost synonymous with literary production for 200 or 300 years, and syphilis and so on. But I think that, you know, if we think about the impact of the Napoleonic War, let's say, in Victorian or pre-Victorian England, we don't look to a specific novel about the war. We are looking at the kind of the margins, why the soldiers arrive in a Jane Austen novel the way they do. That it's something that's shaping all of the movements of characters and their sense of their self, but it's not visible in a kind of thematic level. And my feeling is that the impact of the COVID crisis is so broad, and as you've all of you have said so well, so sort of invisible and complex and highly visible for many people and marginal for others, that it's going to be felt in a similarly kind of subterranean way, I think. It will cause seismic changes in so many aspects of life, every aspect of life, to some degree, I would say. But for that reason, it'll be kind of part of the fabric of how people write about the present moment and the immediate future. There will be science fiction novels about more pandemics, no doubt, but I don't see them necessarily being great literature.
Yeah, there's a question that's come in, and I think in some ways you've already answered it, but we might want to take further responses. Someone is saying, regarding the boringness of this pandemic, that's in quotation marks, and how it hasn't changed our routines too much, do you really believe it will affect current literature so much and that it will appear in future novels in such an obvious way? Or do you think it will have a more underlying presence? I guess that's maybe a question for Raili really in particular, but I think, Stephen, you've already touched on it there. Raili, I don't know if you wanted to respond.
I think that I would say exactly what Stephen was saying, that I don't think that it needs to be thematized, but we might find new spaces in texts to just handle boredom, something that our age of overconsumption of images and texts just hasn't encouraged. And I don't know whether that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, take time off Twitter and spend more time on indolence, but that there's some, I mean, that would be interesting to see.
Yeah, and I suppose, and there's also recourse to literature to a certain extent, and when people try to allegorize their own experience. And I mean, there have been some, some obvious choices in that respect. And obviously Camus' The Plague has been much read and discussed, and other less familiar sources. I've been reading Thoreau's Walden as an interesting sort of case. Now that's voluntary isolation, but nonetheless an interesting text to think about, of a certain forms of attention that become possible by dislocating the present voluntarily or otherwise. I wanted to ask maybe a final question, because we should start wrapping up, but we didn't really touch on the presence of figurative language, metaphor in particular, in public discourse in this time, which certainly to me has been very striking. And I think there've been some national variations on it. I mean, Stephen, you have access both to the UK, where you've been based, but Sweden. But I was thinking, I mean, Boris Johnson being the great proliferator of metaphor, if I can put it that way. But clearly, the wartime metaphor has dominated in many places. Not interestingly enough in Ireland, and maybe because of our tradition of being a neutral country, we don't really rush in that direction. But I don't know if anybody wanted to comment on metaphor in public speech and its role, or figurative language more generally.
Well, of course, Macron has done that too. He's talking about the war in French, of course, but he's used to say, so what kind of world leaders are we looking at when they use these metaphors? It has to serve them in what they want to achieve within their own careers, I think. Yeah. And war is such a poignant image, isn't it? I mean, with Johnson, of course, he harks back to his predecessors and tries to imitate the rhetoric of Winston Churchill at all times, even the movements. When you study him, I mean, that's what he's doing. And this is his war. So he was wounded at one point, I mean, it's kind of continuation of that. So it's interesting how they make use of this terrible disease to further their own ends, I would say. I mean, they might not be doing it intentionally. And with Johnson, I'm not sure he invented this. It might be Cummins, as a kind of puppet behind him, or he's the puppet rather. But metaphor is crucial in the discourse about this disease. Absolutely.
Raili, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I would just add that another kind of metaphoric domain that seems to be evoked a lot is containment, the kind of an idea of closing and containing. And I think that that's actually something that we need to be very attentive to, because that probably has deep implications to, well, all kinds of collaborations, cross-border collaborations, not just immigration, because we too are sitting on Zoom, not being able to meet, and those kinds of closings off and distancings, I think, will be
Yeah, and of course, one of the other dominant metaphors has been that of cocooning, at least in English. I'm not sure in other language traditions. So again, these are widely available, but they do a certain kind of work in themselves, and they present the government as being a very caring kind of entity. Whereas we've seen and that we've discussed, the kind of care homes have been the great sort of sites of disaster, in effect, internationally. I mean, the Swedish case is interesting, Stephen. I don't know if you have any comment on the sort of public discourse in Sweden, where there seems to be fairly, up to now, a relatively strong separation between the science and the science authority and government statement making on it, at least as far as it's been disseminated outside of Sweden. I don't know whether metaphor has dominated at all, or whether it's been a more low-key.
I don't think so. I mean, metaphors, as we know, are lies, and Swedes pride themselves on speaking truth, on however painful at all times. I don't know. Time will tell about Sweden's strategy, but I certainly admire the transparency and the faith in citizens' responsibility and sense of duty. I think that's very admirable. We could all learn from that, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, if I could circle back a little bit to my point about Defoe, I think it's also the sense in which a lot of the charts and so forth that have been presented ritually, at least particularly in the UK in the daily briefings, which have now stopped, served a kind of metaphorical function. I mean, they weren't really the thing in themselves, but they were doing a certain kind of work in that way. So I guess that's part of, if I can draw to a close, a kind of part of this general purpose of our discussion, I think, is to think more seriously about how literature is working its way through our relationship to this moment of crisis, where it has been clearly in previous times in ways that could have continued to be a resource to us. But that if we redirect some of our attentions to the literary and to the narrative resources of crisis, I think we'll find ourselves in a stronger intellectual position in our relationship to this phenomenon. So I just wanted to thank you all very much for participating today. It's been great to have the opportunity of the ENLIGHT as a platform to engage in new conversations, and ones that I very much look forward to continuing. So thank you again to Esther and to colleagues in Göttingen for sponsoring the series and taking it forward. So we look forward to further contributions there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, for moderating this talk.
Pleasure.